Did you have like a script or something that you wanted to go off of, or?
Um, I've got some notes here, but so I can read those out, and then you can say what you need to say, and then we can go from there.
Okay, sure.
If if you want to do like an introduction or anything, then you can do that.
Okay. Um, well, I guess just to recap what you and I already know, but the listener might not know. You and I have been talking. We met on Reddit, and we've been exchanging messages for a couple of weeks, I think.
Mhm.
You gave me some material to check out. I watched a video from Bad Mouse and
Mhm.
one on Cuba and like how their democratic system works.
Yeah.
And I think I don't know. Did I give you? I don't know if I gave you much, but I
Um.
have my own videos that you might have watched.
Yeah. I've seen some of your videos. Particularly your one about entitled "Schism: How the State Fuels Tribalism," and you also gave me a video about Keynes and Hayek, and about it was like a rap battle video, but it was also kind of had a lot of messages about their respective views on economics.
Yeah, I really like that, and I'll link all that
Mm,
stuff in the video description.
yeah. So before we start, I'd just like to make it clear: a lot of people who call themselves socialists, whenever people talk about places like Cuba or China or the Soviet Union, they say, "Oh, that wasn't real socialism." I'm not a proponent of that idea. I do think they were real implementations of socialism. I just think there were conditions at the time that led them to not implement socialism to the ideal that some people would want. But so I will still be talking about states like that and using them as examples of actual socialism.
Okay, so you think that Russia and China actually had the right idea, but maybe something got in the way, so they weren't able to carry it out.
Yeah, yeah. I think the people there and the leaders there, they were trying to implement a proper socialist system, but then again, there were certain factors that led to their implementations not being absolutely ideal and still having some flaws. And also, obviously, there were flaws in with the actual leaders themselves and their ideas, which we need to look at, and we can't just sort of say, "Oh, they did everything right. We need to follow them." But at the same time, we can still learn from those ideas and those implementations.
Okay. Well, that reminds me of a common criticism of a lot of different communist ideas, which is that, you know, if you have this idea that the system only needs the right circumstances and the right people, um, what would you say if someone were to ask, well, what happens when you never get the right people? What happens when, the stars never align and your system isn't able to work? Because, there's always going to be a hiccup. Like, what if every person who comes along is a Stalin or a Mao? I don't know if you'd credit those people with being the downfall of those systems, but
Well, I think um, when you're talking about factors that affected the success or failure of certain socialist states, they're often very sort of multifaceted, and there's a lot of various causes behind them. And human error and errors in the ways of thinking of certain socialist leaders are definitely to blame for a lot of the wrongdoings and the failures of socialist systems. However, I think the larger thing that you need to consider is the external factors that were acting upon that country. Like, for instance, one of the reasons that the Soviet Union in particular was a very authoritarian country, particularly in the build-up to World War II, was because there was a very real threat of conspirators against the government and of fascist collaborators. And that isn't to say that things like the Great Purges or the Katyn massacre or anything. That's not to say they were justified. It's just to say that that was one of the factors that led to those certain actions taken by those governments. But to say, I think to look at the failures of past socialist states and then to lead that to the conclusion that socialism can't work as an ideal, that would be an invalid conclusion to make, in my opinion, because there have, of course, been variations in various socialist countries, and that's one of the reasons why certain socialist countries failed and others succeeded. for example, most socialist countries that have existed have capitulated back into capitalism, and one of the only examples that hasn't is Cuba. And so we have to look what's different about Cuba than about the Soviet Union or East Germany or any other socialist country. And I think researching into that, the prime difference is that Cuba has a much more comprehensive system of democracy, where the leaders are accountable to the actual people in the country, and so they can't sort of lead the country astray without the people in the country. They have a way of stopping that.
Okay. So the Cubans, you say, have like a better system that makes them accountable.
Yeah, because often you see with socialist countries what will happen is the leader will die and then a different faction within the leading party will take over or something. But with a system of representative democracy like they have in Cuba, that isn't really possible, because you can't have these different groups fighting. It's all delegates that have been elected by the people.
I have to admit, I don't know a lot about the Cuban electoral system other than I did watch the video that you sent me, but I'm trying to think, how could it be that, a system can guarantee that there won't be some sort of takeover, or like, how can a system be immune to a new political interest taking control?
Well, that's the thing, is that it can't really. Like, you look at, say, if a country were militarily invaded by another country, then there's no system that can fight against that, really. And so that's one of the things that I actually meant when I said the external factors, is that there's always going to be people who will want other systems and who will want to not necessarily maintain the system you have in place. And so that was what led to things like various uprisings in Eastern Europe, for example, throughout the 20th century. And the way that those sort of people who disagree with the system, the way they're dealt with is one of the most important factors as to whether that system will succeed. And I think that's why the Cuban system has succeeded, where the Russian system or the Chinese system perhaps failed.
How, in what way would you say the Cuban system is a success? Just that they're still maintaining the sort of old communist ideal?
Well, I mean, yeah, if that's the metric that we're going to use to judge success, is whether they've been able to maintain their system without people uprising against it.
Okay, so maintaining so that's sort of a conservative idea, isn't it? That as long as you can keep change from happening, then you're doing something right.
Well, no, that's not necessarily what I meant. What I'm meaning is that in this particular area we're discussing right now of the capitulation of certain states back to capitalism, that's the metric for success we're measuring now. Whether that's a metric for success overall is a separate matter.
Okay.
Because
But I don't know that this is the case for most Cubans, but let's just say hypothetically we had another country that was had like a predominantly communist ideology, and that changed over time to where, let's say, 75% of the population favored freer markets and less government control, and what you would call capitalism, and that still was able to, the government still enforced a sort of communist system. Would you say that that's a success? And how does that reconcile with democracy? If you favor democracy, how can you have it both ways?
Well, no, that wouldn't be a success, because clearly if it's gotten to a point where the majority of people disagree with what the government's doing, I don't think we should just continue a system we shouldn't just continue a system that I would think is better just because I think it's better. We should approve of a system where it benefits the majority of the people. And if the majority of people in a country aren't happy with a certain system, then it's clear that we should either seek to improve it in some way or just get rid of it. So no, I don't think we should try to impose any system on people who don't want it.
Okay, I think we have some common ground there because I
Yeah.
think that the government that people are going to choose for themselves is the government that they should get. But I'm
Yeah.
just trying to make sense of you're using, I guess, communism remaining the prevailing ideology in Cuba as a metric for success because that in itself doesn't really tell us the whole story.
Well, that's true. I mean, whether you judge that as a success or not is obviously dependent on whether you think socialism is better than capitalism or vice versa.
Okay. So would it be more accurate to say Cuba's a success because the people want communism and they got communism?
Yeah, yeah, and I'd say from my point of view, it's certainly a success because they've maintained socialism, and I think because when you look at what, for instance, when capitalism came to Russia, the effects there were drastic. I mean, the poverty rate went up to I think it was 60% in Ukraine and 40% in Russia, and people started eating less food, poverty went up, unemployment went up, and all these things happened. And regardless of whether you think capitalism in theory is better or socialism in theory is better, when you look at the implementation of capitalism in Russia in practice, I don't think there's any way to argue that it's benefited people. And so, um, judging from that experience, I'd say the maintenance of socialism in Cuba is a good thing because we've seen that when capitalism came to Russia and to Eastern Europe, it wasn't good there. There wasn't the freedom and the increase in living standards that people thought there was going to be.
Hmm. Okay. Did you say there's no way to argue that capitalism has benefited people?
I'd say looking at the example of Russia, then it would be very difficult to argue that capitalism has been good there.
In that instance,
Yeah, in that specific instance, yeah.
would you call Russia today or a capitalist country?
Yeah, going by what I understand to be the definition of capitalism, then yes, it would be.
Okay. How would you define capitalism?
Well, using the definition that's often used by socialists is that it's a system where the means of production are owned privately and where there are there's goods are sold on the free market and people are employed in wage labour and because I think that definition is a bit more broad than what some people might propose,
Okay.
but
Um,
I
see, you said people are buying goods on a free market, things are owned privately.
yeah.
Okay. Doesn't the state in Russia have a lot of control over the market?
I'm not entirely educated on that matter, so I don't think I'd be qualified to say. But I do think that the state having influence over the economy is not really the deciding factor in whether a system is socialist or capitalist. The defining factor is which class, the capitalist class or the working class, is the controller of the economy in the state, so to speak.
Okay.
So I think even if there's not necessarily an entirely free market in Russia, and there's not necessarily the ideal that a market libertarian, for instance, would strive for, it's still qualitatively a capitalist system, regardless of whether the markets are as free as you'd like them to be.
Right. And of course, there's going to be some kind of spectrum. Like you're not probably not going to find an example of perfect free markets or an example of
Yeah,
your ideal
yeah, of
either.
course.
But you mentioned two classes that was the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. What did you call them? The property owners and the
Well, I referred to them with the capitalist class and the working class, but bourgeoisie and proletariat are terms you can use as well.
Okay. I saw a video recently that Bad Mouse did, and I think you know him because you showed me he had a video on personal and private property.
Yeah, yeah.
And I really didn't like the way he tried to distinguish between the capitalists and the working class. I really don't think it can be done very easily, because there's a lot of overlap between the two of them. And I think the example he gave was something like a person generating $300 of wealth in a day, and then going home at the end of the day with $50. And it sort of paints this picture of, a lot of people in a factory on a floor turning out widgets, and then they just have like this overseer who's just, up in his office counting his money. And I don't really think that is a really good reflection of the way the economy actually works. I don't know if a system like that has ever... I mean, there probably has been something closer to like that, especially in the early industrial age. But I think, especially with the numbers he gave $300 created in a day and $50 for the worker. But, a lot of companies, most companies have a profit margin more like 10%. And a lot of these companies aren't even privately owned. They're owned, by the market, by shareholders. And in a lot of cases, the person doing the work might also own stock in the company, or might own a house and be renting to somebody. You know what I mean? So it's kind of hard to draw a clear distinction between people who own things and people who work for those people.
Yeah, I think the idea that you're talking about there and that Bad Mouse tried to cover is the idea of surplus value. Are you familiar with that term?
Yeah, I've heard it. You want to go ahead and give me your take on it?
Yeah, yeah. So the idea of surplus value that was laid out by Karl Marx is that in a capitalist workplace, let's say for instance it's a workplace it's a factory that's making chairs. So the capitalist is the one who owns the factory. They buy the raw materials and the tools needed, and various other things. And the worker is the one who takes what's provided to them by their employer, by the capitalist, and they put in the labour to turn the wood into the chair. And it's their labour that gives the thing that they're doing value.
Mm-hmm.
And so the conclusion that Marx drew from that is that the worker is the one who's the person making value, because a pile of wood on its own isn't really worth much, and so the worker by their labour adds value to the product, and the capitalist then goes on to sell that product, and they give the worker a fraction of that profit and keep the rest of the profit for themselves. And this, to Karl Marx, was the defining feature of what made capitalism exploitative, because the worker isn't being remunerated for all of the value that they've produced. And so, regardless of whether the company itself is owned by one private individual or by a group of people or by shareholders, if there's still that system of the extraction of surplus value, then in Karl Marx's view at least, that system still has a capitalist element within it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I've heard that before, and I guess I just don't buy the idea that, first of all, I don't like the way that the word exploit is always used, because it seems, it's sort of a loaded term, and really all it means is you're benefiting from somebody else. And if that's what we're talking about, it goes both ways. I mean, the person who signs up and goes to work in a factory is doing it for some benefit, unless we're talking about a slave system, which isn't what free market people are advocating for. They're advocating for a system where both of these people are free agents, and this is some kind of system that they opted into.
Yeah, I get what you're saying there, and I think the reason that the term exploit is used rather than viewing it as this mutually beneficial activity is because in a Marxist view of the world, the capitalist is not the one who is contributing value to a business. All of the functions undertaken by the capitalist could be undertaken by, say, a council of the people who work at a certain business. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at it like that, you begin to see that the capitalist isn't the one who's actually making the business run and providing value to the business, and so their role in society is ultimately superfluous and unneeded.
Hmm.
At least if you follow the viewpoint of Karl Marx's findings.
Yeah, I understand that viewpoint, and I think it's a really tempting idea. It basically, I think what's tempting about it is it's saying, hey, there's all this waste, and it can just simply be eliminated, and then we can all be much more prosperous because we won't have this huge waste going on. And actually,
Yeah.
I think people have been talking about this for a long time, even before Marx. I think Confucius talked about merchants being unnecessary in society, but I think, unfortunately, it's not true. I think that merchants, bankers, all these people contribute a lot to society, and
Yeah.
even if it's not through assembling a chair, whether it's just logistics or allocating funds and sort of like weighing different priorities against one another, it has value.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, and I'm not at all implying that the roles that are currently undertaken by capitalists are not needed in society or do not produce value in of themselves. What I am saying is that their position of owning the business
Hmm.
should not entitle them to um, should not entitle them to take value from other people's work like it does today. Like I said, I'm not saying that the capitalist doesn't do any work or doesn't contribute to society. What I am saying is that everything that they do, every all the work that they do and that they do contribute to society, doesn't justify their position of power over the other people
Okay, so
and their position.
you're saying that the amount that they get paid uh, in respect to how much work they're doing is just unfair. You're saying.
Well, that's one way to look at it, but I'm more implying that um, it's not about the work, about the amount of money they get. It's about the fact that they are deriving money from other people's work, from their employees' work.
Well,
But
yeah,
yeah,
I guess that's in a way that's true, but in my mind, that's kind of like what society is all about. We all contribute in some way, and we benefit from each other, and it's sort of a cooperative effort. As long as it's a
yeah,
voluntary cooperative effort, and everybody's getting out of it what they agreed, you know what I mean? I don't see that there's anything wrong with that.
yeah, yeah. I agree with that, but I think our viewpoints differ in that I see it as kind of lopsided. How there's an imbalance of power there,
Oh,
and so you say that it's mutually beneficial because both the worker and the capitalist, if we're looking at this purely in terms of class, they are both getting something out of it. But I think that's kind of a false viewpoint because yes, the worker is getting paid a wage, but they're only benefiting in the sense that they're getting more than they would do if they weren't employed, if they were unemployed, because then they wouldn't be getting any money at all. And so when you're sort of looking at it, your view is confined to the present day system, and you're not thinking, are these is this capitalist class really needed in society? Are they really could their current roles not just be undertaken um, by sort of public employees or ordinary people in the service of society as a whole, rather than wanting to pocket the profit for themselves?
hmm I I guess I don't see how you're drawing this distinction between the capitalist class and the working class. It just seems like there's some people on another side of the exchange there, and you saying we could just replace them with regular people. It seems to me that they are regular people.
Well, yeah, I mean, I didn't speak very clearly there, I must admit, but what I mean is that they are ordinary people. I mean, they're not like a separate breed or anything. What I'm saying is that the role that they occupy in society um, does not justify itself. It's not the role that they occupy where they are put in a position of power above other people through the system of private ownership, and where they can reap the profits from the collective labour of the entire business,
Hmm.
is not ethical and not justifiable. And what I'm saying is that, and that's where the distinction between private ownership and collective ownership comes into it, because when you have private ownership, you have one individual or a group of individuals who own a certain business, and they have the say in how that business is run, and that's what makes them the capitalists. That's what makes them have a separate position as a member of a different class. Whereas in collective ownership, things like factories or businesses, they're not owned by private individuals, but by essentially by the community, but the manifestation that takes can differ.
Okay. Maybe it would help if we instead of just talking about it in such an abstract way, what if we talk about like a real example, like some sort of public corporation, let's say, I don't know what sounds good to you.
What you mean, like an example of a company?
Yeah, like an example of
Yeah.
a company that.
Yeah. Let's say like a shop, for instance, just like a general store.
Okay, how about a bakery? Would that work?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you have a bakery, and the
Hmm.
guy owns it, and I imagine you'd say the guy owning it is the capitalist.
Yeah.
Okay, so he has some people come into his shop, and he's got flour and all this the ovens and everything that he needs, and
Yeah.
he pays these people to bake the bread, and he pays them by the hour, and
Yeah.
after they've sold the bread, he gives them what he agreed, and there's some left over, and he uses that to buy more flour, more supplies, pay rent,
Hmm.
um, and maybe advertise the business, do any kind of upkeep. But
Yeah.
generally, like I said earlier, he's only looking at like 10% of he's only looking at like a 10% profit margin. So all of this money's coming in and going back out. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And then I guess to make it even more illustrative of what we have today, this bakery, maybe it didn't get started on its own, right? He didn't just show up with enough money to build this thing and hire all these workers. He got investment from the community, and
Hmm.
he's really just acting as a representative of the community because he took money from his neighbors, his family, his friends,
Yeah.
and they all put this up, and it's his job to make sure that this endeavor turns a
Yeah.
profit. So it seems
Yeah.
like the capitalist way of doing things kind of achieves a lot of what you're looking for in that it's community ownership.
Yeah.
But a problem with it if the government's doing this is it's not voluntary. That's my
Hmm.
big hang up.
Yeah. Yeah. I see what you're saying there, and I think the example that we've used of one individual bakery where there's one person that owns it and he sort of does the job of running it and advertising it and buying all the new machinery and things. I think it's a very sort of utopian example, and it's a trap that a lot of people fall into when they're thinking about capitalism and about free trade and things, because the majority of businesses aren't really like that. The majority of businesses are these big corporations, these big conglomerates, and these big sort of chains that where the majority of work put into the business isn't done by the owner, by the capitalist. It's done by administrators and managers that are hired by the capitalist.
Mm-hmm.
Like, take for instance Amazon. Jeff Bezos himself obviously doesn't do all the work required in running Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
He hires like a few managers or a few administrators, and the advertising is dealt with by another company. And so what we can see from that is that Jeff Bezos himself, well, just any capitalist, they're paying all these other people to do all the work that he did in your example.
Mm-hmm.
And so eventually what he can do is he can use the wealth he's already got, and he can pay all these people to do all this work for him, and it can get to such a point where he has to do extremely little work, and he can reap a lot of profit off of that purely because he's got all that money in the first place, and he can say to people, I'll pay you X amount of money if you do this. And so
Okay,
I'd like,
I think you were right to go there because
yeah,
I don't think probably a lot of people like you aren't really mad at the local bakery for what they're doing.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
Amazon is a high-profile example. So,
mm,
but Jeff Bezos, he doesn't own Amazon, right? He's the CEO.
yeah,
So when you talk about um, community ownership, you still have that. I mean, a corporation is open to the public. You can own a piece of Amazon if you want, and then Jeff Bezos works for you, and all the work that he does turns profit for you because you own the company. And I'll bet you he actually does do a lot of work. I'll bet you that guy works 100 hours a week, like easy.
yeah. I see what you're saying about like I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that capitalists are just like you see in a lot of propaganda. They're just these lazy people who don't do any work and they just sit counting the money all day. I'm not really saying that. I'm not trying to paint a picture of those people like that. And I think we can have our disagreements about whether about the nature of um, a business and how it operates and who really controls it and who makes the profit. But I think the bottom line is that it's the system of private ownership is what allows for this kind of system to arise, where you have. I'm sorry to go back to this example, but I just think no matter how you try and change a company to be sort of voluntary or decentralized ownership or anything, but I still think no matter how you try and change it, there's still going to be that bottom line of the owners and the producers, and the owners reaping the rewards off of the producers' work.
Well, there are
Mm.
some benefits that the owners get for the work that's done by employees, but the employees also benefit with their partnership with the owner. And if they weren't
Well,
benefiting, and if it wasn't enough of a benefit to satisfy them, they don't have to do it, right?
well, I'd say that that's sort of so. What you're saying is that um, capitalism, employment in a capitalist workplace, is a voluntary action. Is is that what you're saying?
Um, well, I don't want to start defending capitalism because I don't know if we've defined it. And I definitely wouldn't
Well,
call this system that we live in, well, we can call it capitalism if you want. It's not the
mm,
system that I would advocate. But I would advocate for a system where, yeah, you're doing a job because you agreed to it, and you get out of
yeah.
it, whatever is fair based on the agreement.
Mm. I think there are a few problems with that. There's nothing wrong with that. That is a good ideal to work towards, but I think the error in that method of thinking is believing that the system of we can call it capitalism if you like, but the system of private ownership and of a free market isn't what can provide that isn't what can provide the manifestation of that worldview, because you talk about wanting to have a voluntary system where people only work because they've agreed to it and because they've agreed how much they're going to get paid and other things like that. And I don't think a system based on private ownership can provide that, because a system of private ownership gives the owner much more bargaining power than the workers themselves. And we've seen that historically. People used to be overworked to death in a lot of cases. There used to be, people working 12 hours a day in workhouses. And it was only when the workers organised themselves into trade unions that they were able to have the bargaining power to negotiate on equal terms. And so you have to take into account, yes, it may be a voluntary system, but you also have to look, are there certain imbalances in power, and do different individuals have a different level of influence that has been afforded to them because of the system of private ownership? And that can sort of influence people's decisions and make it so that it's not an entirely free choice.
Okay. Um, well, a couple of things that struck me about that. One is I think that people have a habit when they're criticizing capitalism to go back and look at like the early industrial era, things like that, and the miserable conditions that people lived in, and I can see why. But I think it's important to remember that life has, for the most part, through history, been fairly miserable, right? So,
Yeah.
and as impossible as it might seem, these people were actually pouring into this system because this was much better than the alternative. This was much better than what people had been dealing with for a long time. So, like the Irish pouring into the Northeast while the United States was industrializing, they were just escaping an agrarian system that, they were having a famine. That was just the thing that used to happen.
Can I just stop you there for a second?
Okay.
You talk about Ireland, yeah. You talk about them escaping an agrarian system. One of the prime reasons for the Irish potato famine, and this is one of the points that I actually wanted to move on to, was the Irish potato famine. There was a fungal blight, and that was responsible for a lot of crop failures, but what is often forgotten is that Ireland was producing enough food for people to eat comfortably, and the only reason that they were exporting so much food is because they were a subject of the British Empire. And the British Empire is something that is often lauded by people for spreading, property rights, the rule of law, and things like that. And so you talk about them escaping the alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I agree. Capitalism, for a time, it did cause a tremendous increase in living standards. And it did bring a lot of people out of poverty, and it did raise the living standards a lot. But I think in the context of this discussion we're having here, I don't really think that that discussion is necessarily the most relevant thing to be talking about.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Because
my point is only that, things have not always been ideal. Things have never been ideal for people. And just to say that, people had to live in miserable conditions while under capitalism, people have lived under miserable conditions in all sorts of other ways. So I don't necessarily think that's something that's unique to industrialization, I guess is what I was saying.
Yeah.
Now I've sort of lost my other thought, which is what I thought was more important.
Yeah, I think we've gotten rather off track here, and originally we were going to come on here to discuss the question of whether socialism promotes or restricts personal liberty.
Okay.
And I think so. I had some points that I've written down earlier that I'd like to propose. So if we can just leave that conversation we were having earlier, we can sort of leave that for now, if you'd like.
Sure.
So I'll talk about why I think socialism promotes personal liberty now, if you'd like, if that's all right.
Okay.
Okay, so let me just check my notes here. So I have three main points as to why I believe that socialism promotes personal liberty to a greater extent than capitalism can. The first point, and perhaps the most important one, is that when you're talking about freedom and the ability to make choices for yourself and to control your own life, there are certain things that you have to have access to in order to live that way. For example, people need to have access to education to make a free choice about which career they want to do, and people have to have freedom from poverty and a substantial income to make choices about what they want to spend,
mm-hmm.
what they want to spend their money on. And so the best way to ensure personal liberty for people is to ensure that the members of a society have access to the things they need in order to live a free and fulfilling life. So that you need to make sure they have access to education, to housing, to food, to healthcare and various things like that. And the system that is best able to do that is, in my opinion, and in my the opinion that I've come to in the course of looking at different socialist systems in theory and in practice, is that socialism is the system that's best able to do that.
Okay. Can we talk about that a little bit before you go on to your other points?
Yeah.
So
we can discuss the points separately if you. Yeah.
I think I mentioned this in my schism videos, But Isaiah Berlin, I think, was the first person to coin the terms positive and negative liberty. And
Yeah.
my question for you, because it's what you're describing, the need for an education, the need for housing,
Mm,
and freedom from poverty. These are all positive
yeah.
liberties. These are things that somebody has to give you.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
where would you think to get these things from?
How do you mean? I don't
So
understand what I'm asking.
if a person needs to be free to have a home, um, you see what I'm saying about positive and negative. If you leave somebody a
Yeah,
home,
yeah. I'm familiar with those terms. Yeah.
if I leave someone alone, that's not going to give them a home. So I'm going to have to
Hmm.
provide them a home is what's really going to happen. And how am
Yeah.
I going to do that is my question for you.
Well, the point that I was trying to make was that this was that you can look at various means of providing people with homes, education, healthcare, and all the things I mentioned, and a socialist system and a socialist state whose defining feature is that they have. Okay, so to answer your question, how to provide people with these things, I believe that the best way to do that would be having a state in place whose main priority is not to protect business interests, is not to protect the interests of any one particular group, but whose interest lies in providing all members of society with the things that we talked about. And the best way that such a state would do that, I believe, is through a planned economy, a socialist planned economy with the public good in mind.
Hmm.
And I believe that does that answer your question sufficiently?
Um, well, not really, because I still don't understand what in what way are they going to provide me a home? Are they going to? Is there going to be some public official who's going to come out and build it for me?
Well, you'd have the people who build. Let's you have the people who build the home in the first place, and you have you have to go through the process of acquiring a certain home, and so in a capitalist system, that's all individual groups of people who are monetarily compensated for their work in individual instances. In a socialist system, what you would have, what I imagine you would have, is that the work done building the home, the work done providing you with the home, would be organised by members of the community itself, whether that's through a socialist state of the Marxist-Leninist variety, or whether that's through local councils, as you see in syndicalism. But the main feature is that it's there's a definite plan to what is being done, and that all members of society would have a say in that plan, and we can modify it so that if people don't have enough housing, they can voice their concerns and say, we need to build more housing, and so members of the community would decide on that plan, and they would carry out that plan accordingly, and they would compensate people for their work um, by by allowing them access to all the things that are needed, in a similar way in which people would be rewarded with money under capitalism. People would be rewarded the same way under socialism to a degree. They would still be compensated for their work.
Okay. I guess what I'm driving at, maybe I should have asked the question more pointedly, but I didn't want to put words in your mouth. But what I imagine happening under a socialist system, because I can't see it happening any other way, is that the government is going to decide, and it might not be a dictator, it might be, like you said, it might be like a group that votes on it. They're going to decide that a house needs to be built. And let's say I'm one of the people who builds houses. Does that mean that I have to build the house because they decided on it? And if they offer to compensate me and I'm not happy with the compensation, do I still have to do it? And after the home is built, who does it go to? I mean, there's not always going to be enough homes for everyone, right? Like, what if we started today? who's her first home going to go to?
That's a very interesting question, and that's quite a good that is quite a good criticism of the planning method. And I think these are all sort of nuances that would have to be the questions of who's going to get the house, who's going to build it. They're all nuances that would have to be figured out in the situation. But what you said about the worker who makes the house being compelled to make it, that's a very good point. And I think there is going to have to be a degree of compulsion, as there is in any system. But the defining feature of a socialist system is that you would have a greater say in the type of work that you do. However, yes, to answer your question, yes, there would have to be an element of compulsion in that. But I don't think that's necessarily unjust. Is it unjust to force somebody to provide for people? Is it unjust to compel somebody to work for the good of their community? And I think you could argue that yes, it is, but I would be of the opinion that people have to have homes, people have to have food, and the only way they can be provided for that is if people work to give them those things. And so unfortunately, yes, there would have to be an element of compulsion.
Okay. So, we started this off, you were going to give us 3 points on how your system would allow for a more liberty. It was more libertarian than a free market. Wasn't that your point?
Yeah.
And it seems like it seems to me, if you're going to have people working under, that's slavery. If you're compelled to work, that's just slavery. And it's basically what you're doing is you're subordinating this person's view, this person's opinion, to some central planner or some central planning organization, even if it is a democracy. If the neighborhood votes and decides that I have to go build a house for my neighbor when I would rather spend my time, maybe I think that my time would be better spent taking care of my garden, or I found a factory I can go to work and I can provide for my family better than the compensation that's being offered to me for building this guy a house. If I'm told, no, you can't take that opportunity, we've decided you're going to build a house for your neighbor, to me that's unjust.
Yeah, I can definitely see what you're saying, and I think that is a legitimate concern. But what you'd have to consider is that a lot of people, and very rightly, they view the state as this external authority that imposes its will on people, and that is certainly true in today's society, at least. But the defining aspect of a socialist state is that it wouldn't be this external authority that can tell people what to do without being held accountable for that. The defining feature would be that it would have to rely on the participation of a large majority of society. And also what you're saying about production decisions being made by a central authority. Historically, that hasn't always been the case. For instance, during the Cultural Revolution in China, a lot of the production teams and a lot of the agricultural communes that were set up had a very high degree of independence from the central government, and so decisions weren't always made by some bureaucrat sat 100 miles away. And to move on to your point about would you be forced to build a house for somebody else? Well, I think you would certainly not be deprived of a voice on the matter entirely. If you didn't want to do the work that had been allotted to you, you would certainly be able to voice that concern and be able to say, I don't think I should do. I don't want to do this work. I don't think I should do this work. And any other concerns, really, any concerns, and you could take that to to whoever it is that has decided you're going to do that work. And in an ideal system that I would be proposing, they would try to take that concern legitimately and ask, why don't you want to do that work? What is it about the work that you don't like? And they would be compelled by the system of democracy in place to take your concerns into account. Like, for instance, like I said in Cuba, the people making the decisions about production are democratically elected, and they can be recalled at any time if people are not happy with what they're doing. And so if there were injustices on that scale taking place, then, in an ideal system of socialist democracy, people could say, what's happening isn't right. We're being forced to do this work that we don't want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And they could have a say against that.
Okay. Yeah, I guess the last thing I have to say on that is, if we took a vote 10-1, and the decision was that I was going to be a slave, it would be little consolation to me that at least we had a vote before it was decided that I was going to be a slave. Do you know what I'm saying? So It seems that the end result is a little bit more important. And it sounds like you acknowledge that some people might be compelled, and that's just a cost to your system. And I'm not saying that a free market doesn't come with any downsides. So it sounds like we pretty much understand each other. And I know you have 2 other points, so we can move on to your second point if you want.
Yeah. All right. So my second point, which is kind of related to the first point, is that in a socialist society, the work performed would be more free, and that's for several reasons. Because the first reason is that it would not take place in the same kind of exploitative relationship as it does under capitalism, where you have somebody who is subordinated to their employer and has to work according to their employer's demands. Otherwise, they would, if they tried to protest against that, they could be kicked from their job. They could become unemployed. And so before I move on, would you like to debate that point, or would you? Should I finish my reasons first?
No, go ahead.
All right. And so the second reason why the work would be freer is because the individual, in my ideal system at least, the individual would have a greater degree of autonomy over the type of work they do, how long they work for, and so forth. And I think that's something we've talked about before, but so we could keep talking about that if you want, or move on later. And the third thing I had to say was that in a socialist society there wouldn't be the same imbalance that there is with the employers and the workers as 2 separate classes, and so the workers could not be threatened with unemployment if they didn't meet the demands of their employer.
What would they be threatened with? I mean, if I was told by the state that I had to grow wheat and I just said I wasn't going to do it, what would be the consequence?
Well, I imagine that in a socialist system, for instance, I know that in the Soviet Union, if people refused to work, and if people just completely refused to participate in the system that they had in place, then they would be denied the benefits of that system. And so you could argue that that's just or unjust, but I know that that's how it's been implemented in the past. And so what I would try to add to that is that you would have to give a valid reason as to why you don't want to work. Like in the present day capitalist system, if you want to call it that, the same thing exists. You can't just say to your boss, "I don't want to work," because then they'll just fire you. The difference with a socialist system is they would ask, why don't you want to do this work? Is there any other work you'd like to do? And because there would be guaranteed employment, the people who are employing you would not be able to say, "Oh, you're just out of a job." Then they would have to, in a system where those power imbalances are corrected for, they would have to take into account your concerns and your needs.
Well, it sounds like in the first case that you mentioned, that's exactly what they're doing. They're saying, how did you put it? You're no longer entitled to the benefits of the system. If you go to work and you're not going to do your job, that's what they're going to say. They're going to say you're not entitled to the
Yeah,
benefits, which is your paycheck.
that's certainly the way it was worded in the Constitution of the Soviet Union. If you look, I'm not sure particularly which article it is, but it's saying how you know I think the exact wording was something along the lines of those who refuse to work will not be provided for, or something. And yes, that was the way it was implemented in the Soviet Union. But I'm not saying that that's how it ideally could be implemented. And I think that's what I talked about earlier. One of the mistakes that we need to look at and say, was this good? Was this bad? If not, we'll try to think of something that is more just.
Okay. Well, let's say we lived in a communist country, and there was a plan, and my job was to grow wheat, and I just said I wasn't going to do it, and I gave you some reason that I thought was valid, and I just went off and I started doing my own thing. And
Yeah.
what would be keeping me from just working on my own? I guess separate from the system.
Well, looking at historical examples, nothing really. I mean, people think about collectivization in the Soviet Union or in China, and they think, the state came along and took everyone's farms off of them. When in reality, it was much more gradual than that, and a lot of people in the Soviet Union and in China, they still owned their own plots of land, and they still had the option of working it on their own if they wanted to. It's just that the majority of people didn't do that because they saw the benefits that collectivization brought. And so your example of somebody refusing to participate, well, your example of somebody, refusing to participate in a system and saying, I don't think this is right for me. I would rather just go and work on my own. There's nothing inherently preventing you from doing that, but I think the majority of systems that have been implemented in the past haven't been so tolerable towards that, and that's where what I talked about external factors being one of the things you need to take into account. I think the reason that they didn't do that was because they had to, ramp up production and industrialize their countries because socialism has often been implemented in countries that haven't had a heavy industry base beforehand. But if socialism were to be implemented in a first world country, in a highly developed country where we already have enough houses and enough food and enough necessary resources to provide for people, then that sort of compulsion wouldn't really be necessary. Because one of the things I find interesting, I'm not an anarchist. I wouldn't call myself an anarchist, but there is an anarcho-communist called Peter Kropotkin, and what he wrote about was that the various members of society would be compelled to do a certain amount of necessary work, and as time went on, this amount of necessary work they have to do would be drastically reduced due to advances in technology. And the book that he wrote of this idea in was published in the 1890s, I think, and he estimated that it would only be that it would be 4 hours a day people would be compelled to work in order to provide for people, and that so that was 100 years ago, and today technology can provide for people to such an extent that I think in a modern system people would not necessarily have to be compelled to work because we're not all farmers anymore. We don't all have to provide for ourselves in the realm of food. So looking at historical examples isn't necessarily too applicable today because society has changed a lot, and I think the approaches that would be taken regarding forcing people to work or not allowing them the benefits of society if they don't work, the approaches that would be taken would be drastically different. And that's something that would have to be, that we can't really dream up ideas at this stage. That would have to be something that would be thought up at the time. I mean, because a lot of these questions, I don't necessarily have all of the answers to them, because, talking about building an ideal system where nobody is forced to work, and people aren't compelled to work, they don't have to be told to work. I think that's a very utopian ideal, and that the reality is that in all societies there always has been compulsion, and there always must be, to a greater or lesser degree, some aspect of compulsion. Because if not, then who's going to do the work? And I mean, you could argue that in a communist system, in the sort of the utopia that Marx wrote about, that sort of compulsion wouldn't be necessary. But today, in our society, the immediate concerns of society necessitate that some people be compelled to work. Because otherwise, there would be no guarantee that people could be provided for. And that's where the debate about positive and negative liberty comes into it. Because, is it more important to provide for people, or is it more important not to infringe upon people's liberty? I mean, that's something that's left to the individual, really.
Yeah. You said that we can't have a system where people aren't compelled, and I wonder, what compulsion would you see in a free market? Are you one of these that would say that it's compulsion to ask somebody to do work in exchange for the food that they need? Is that it's the same to you as the plantation slavery that existed in the United States?
I mean, we were talking earlier about, in the Soviet Union, people who didn't work weren't given the benefits of, people who refused to participate in the socialist system weren't provided with the benefits of socialism. And I think, looking at it from an idealist's point of view, that is unjust. But I think there's a very good parallel there, because the exact same thing takes place today, where if you don't work, you become unemployed, and you can't afford food, and then you just starve to death, or you have to, claim benefits for the rest of your life and live in poverty.
But is that the same as compulsion?
Well, yes, it is, because you're threatening you're essentially doing the same thing. You're threatening someone with destitution, which is you're just simply doing it in a less overt way.
Mm-hmm.
I
guess I see that there's a clear distinction between not offering your assistance to someone and actually setting out to do harm to someone. And if your tool to motivate someone to do work for you is that you threaten to do harm, I think that's unjust. But if you choose to reserve your, whatever benefits you have to offer, because the person isn't going to do anything in exchange for that, I think that's fair.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, I agree with you. It is reasonable to say that, if you're just gonna, not produce anything for society, if you're just gonna sit on your ass all day and not go to work, then why are you entitled to the things that other people have worked hard to produce? But I think talking about it from that point of view, saying that that I'd like to just address the point that you seem to be implying that a capitalist system, the individual employer, and I think that's one of the things where a capitalist system would seem to benefit, because the individual employer isn't accountable for providing for people, and so they don't necessarily have the ability to completely deny somebody their right to well-being. But and I think in theory that's true. If you don't want to work at one business, you can work at another, and if you And in a socialist system where all employment is provided by one entity, then it would seem that that entity has much more power and control. And looking at it initially, that would seem to be the truth. However, I think there's quite a lot more nuance to it than that, because one thing that Friedrich Engels wrote in particular is something that I think is very applicable, which is that in a capitalist system, there's no direct slavery. Nobody owns another person. However, there is still a system of pseudo-slavery in that one person is not dependent on another as their master. It's one class is dependent on another as their master. And, that may be seen as a reductionist point of view, but I think it does hold true in that, you can work for one employer or another, but at the end of the day, you're still working for an employer, and it's still the same exploitative relationship.
But what if you're not doing that? I think society can't be cleanly divided the way that you're suggesting. What if I just decide I don't want to work at factory A and I don't want to work at factory B, so I'm just going to work for myself. I'm just going to grow my own food. I'm going to take care of myself. Maybe I'm going to have people work for me.
Yeah, well, that's the problem with looking at society and trying to mould it to your ideals, because what you're describing there is theoretically a perfectly free system, where you can just provide everything for yourself, you're not beholden to any other people. And I think that's not necessarily a very utilitarian way of looking at it, because that certainly isn't feasible for a lot of people. And that's where the conflict comes into it between, trying to create this system of, everything's voluntary, nobody's compelled to work. And then there's the other way of looking at it where you have to think, well, some type of compulsion might certainly be necessary in society. And so I think that that's where sort of our viewpoints might perhaps differ, in that I would look at society as it is and look at it and think, how can it be improved without sort of drifting into the realm of utopia? Whereas the opposite view of that is to say, we have to provide everyone with a system that is completely voluntary, and we're just going to ignore all of the unfortunate truths of reality in doing that. And forgive me if I might be sort of making out as if you're doing something that you're not, but I think looking at it that way is kind of utopian.
Okay. You say that, okay, so you acknowledge that there's going to be some sort of compulsion that's necessary, but you say that compulsion is going to allow you to make society better. How will you know if society is getting better?
Well, there are various measures to determine whether society is better, and the most sort of general one of that is, overall quality of life. And when you talk about society getting better, looking at people's access to looking at people's access to various things like housing and education and healthcare and things. If people have greater access to those things, and if people are living, higher quality lives, then that's really the main measure of how well society is doing. And I've got a study with me today that I sort of prepared in advance. It's called Economic Development, Political Economic System and the Physical Quality of Life by Shirley Seresto and Howard Waitskin. And it's I think it's relevant to this because it does just that. It measures, it looks at various societies and it measures various things like the infant mortality rate, the child death rate, life expectancy, the amount of food people eat, the literacy rate, and various criteria like that that are used to analyse how well a society is doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, the conclusion that it basically draws is that looking at socialist states in the 20th century, they were able to provide that better than capitalist ones could. But that's just a side point.
So the
You know,
study concludes that these socialist states were better than the capitalist states.
if you define having a higher quality of life as they measured it as being better, then yeah, that is the conclusion that it makes.
Okay. Well, that's kind of what I was getting at is, in order to buy into that, you'd have to agree with the way that they define progress in society. And it seems like that's a big problem for a socialist system because you're going to have one idea of progress, and that's going to be the idea that's pursued at the expense of other people's hopes and dreams. Because my idea of progress is sort of irrelevant if my labor is going to be put to use for somebody else's ambitions. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah, I see what you're saying, and I think that's a good point, but I think it's misdirected. I think what you're describing of people's labour not benefiting themselves but going towards somebody else's ambition. I think that's in reality that's much more applicable to a capitalist society than to a socialist one, because in a capitalist society, you know, the people, the workers at any certain enterprise, they don't have a very high degree of control over what the enterprise does. You know, that's the owner's task of deciding what they're going to make, how they're going to make it, etc. And in a socialist system, um, regardless of whatever manifestation it takes, the driving factor is that all the people who are involved in production have a say in what is being produced. And so you talk about your labour going to somebody else's desires. I think that's not necessarily possible in a socialist system, at least not to any meaningful degree. Because if you have a system where everybody can discuss, you know, what type of work they want to do and how they're going to do it, then that kind of disillusionment and that kind of detachment from the result of your own labour isn't really that possible. If you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, it seems like you're leaning a lot on some sort of democratic system to justify the end results, but I guess where we just are going to disagree is, it doesn't matter how much input I'm allowed if at the end of the day what I want is disregarded. So if everybody votes that I'm going to do something that's not in my interest, it's still not in my interest. And that makes it slavery.
Okay, and what makes you think that that kind of system of slavery you're describing is applicable to a socialist system but not a capitalist one?
Well,
I mean,
well,
the way I
again,
go ahead.
I don't know about when we talk about capitalism. I don't want to get stuck defending the status quo, but in a free market system, if all of your transactions are voluntary, if I think that my time is best used growing vegetables, and somebody else disagrees, and there's all this input that comes in, and everybody decides there's better things I could be doing with my time than growing vegetables. I can still grow vegetables. It doesn't matter. I can go work in a factory if I want to, but if I don't like it, I can quit. And
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but looking at reality, the majority of people don't have that choice. They're compelled to work at one institution or another due to things like physical location or what type of skills they have. And the system you're describing, where people have the choice of where they can work when they want to, that doesn't really exist in reality. At least not. It doesn't exist in a capitalist system because people can't just move jobs as easily as you're proposing they can.
well, they don't have access to all options. But you can't lay that at the feet of any one particular system. Some people don't have certain options. If you're 4 foot tall, you're not going to be a professional basketball player. And that's not because somebody's oppressing you. That's just because you don't have that option. But in a free market system, whatever options you do have aren't going to be denied to you by any other person. And I think that's an important distinction. We can't get stuck on the obstacles that nature puts in front of us. Like, yeah, we all have to eat, and if you don't get any food, you're going to starve. But that's nobody else's fault. That's just the way life is. But if somebody else is going to cause you harm, that's what I take issue with.
Yeah. You said one thing that I found interesting that you said was that nobody's going to deny you the opportunity to work somewhere. And I think that's a very interesting point, because that's where the distinction between positive and negative liberty lies, in that, yes, you're not going to be denied the right to apply to a certain job, but that's irrelevant if you don't have the opportunity to do that sort of thing in the first place.
Mm.
And a lot of people... so what I'm trying to really get at is that you can have all the freedom in the world to, do whatever work you want, but ultimately that freedom is meaningless if you're not being given the opportunity to really develop your talents in the first place, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, like maybe you want to be a violinist, but nobody's going to give you the education, provide you the tools, and in that sense you're being sort of deprived of an opportunity. But I think that's sort of a semantic mistake to say that somebody's depriving you of that opportunity. You don't have that opportunity. If you don't have a violin and you don't have any access to instructions, then you don't have it. Nobody's taking it away from you. But if you have the ability to play violin, and that's the career that you want to pursue, and somebody else sets you to work on another task because that's what they'd prefer, then that person's doing you harm. Do you see the distinction that I'm trying to make?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
I think I said this in my video, but I don't think I've said it yet in this conversation. A major problem that I have with positive liberty is it inevitably conflicts with negative liberty. You can't have a guaranteed right to a home or a guaranteed right to an education unless somebody else is being compelled to provide that for you. You see what I'm saying? Because somebody might not educate you. And for the state to guarantee that, they're going to have to compel somebody to educate you. Or they're going to compel somebody to give up enough wealth that they can pay off an educator. But compulsion has to come into it somewhere. Whereas negative liberty is just people hands off. You know what I mean? You can, and there's no conflict. Like if I agree not to interfere with what you're doing, and you agree not to interfere with what I'm doing, there's never going to be a conflict.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, the whole discussion between positive and negative liberty. But I think I sort of differ in my way of thinking, in that I don't really like to analyse these purely as notions or ideas. I think what's more important to do is to look at what these ideas look like when they're implemented in society, and prioritizing positive liberty over negative liberty, so that's giving people opportunities rather than not denying them opportunities. When that is applied in real life and to a society, it gives people much more freedom than the other way around.
But even positive liberties, even if you choose positive liberties over negative liberties, your positive liberties are going to conflict with one another. Because if you're trying to enable somebody to do one thing by providing them an education or a home, you're going to have to compel somebody else, and that might conflict with their positive liberties. Maybe they need their tools to pursue something. There's just an endless possibility for demand on positive liberties. And you're going to have to prioritize at some point. And when you do that, you're going to prioritize some people over other people.
Well, yeah, clearly. I mean, the fact that there are conflicts of interest in these spheres is an inevitable reality. And I think it's a pointless endeavour to try to get rid of those, because due to the fact that people have different desires and different interests, there's always going to be that. And you need a system that can take that into account and that can prioritize these various things. And I think a socialist system is the system that can do that, precisely because it guarantees that people will always have various things that are needed for a free life, like education and healthcare and various things. And so I think trying to create a system where nobody is compelled to provide various things to society is really a pointless endeavour, and it has very drastically negative consequences when you look at these systems as real world examples and not just as concepts. I think positive liberty can provide for people to a much greater extent than negative liberty can, is basically the main point I'm trying to say there.
Okay. But what about... I guess I don't see how... Did you say that prioritizing these negative liberties could be destructive?
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah, I was going to elaborate on that point, but I think still, when you look at it theoretically, I mean, providing people with positive liberties and prioritizing that over negative liberties, when you look at it in the real world, the systems that do that are much better at making sure people live a free life, however you'd like to define that. And that when I was talking about negative liberty being destructive, what I meant is that sure, you can make sure that people are free to make whatever choices they want, but if you don't have a system that's providing for people in the first place, people who are in desperate need of things can simply be ignored because you don't want to compromise on your principles of not compelling people to do certain types of things.
Yeah, they can be ignored. I mean, there might be times when there isn't enough to go around. I guess that's a possibility. But I think people have value, and that's why we cooperate as people. That's why societies exist in the beginning. So you're always going to have some value to offer to society, and they'll have to compensate you for it, or they won't have access to that value. Your labor has value. That's why you have all these these factories setting up and hiring employees, because they need them. It's not like the factories could do without them. And because they need them, that allows the laborer some kind of leverage, and they get what's fair out of that transaction.
Yeah, I see the point you're trying to make, and this is something that Friedrich Engels, a famous socialist thinker, wrote about. He talked about this concept of the reserve army of labour, and that was it was sort of his very early, very primitive sort of not primitive, sort of his early way of trying to explain why there was such an employment under capitalism, or or at least the system that existed when he was alive. And it was saying that when you have this great mass of people that are unemployed, that sort of, as he coined the term, the reserve army of labour, that ensures that the labourer themselves will not have the bargaining power that you're proposing they do have, because if they try to say, I'm not happy with how much I'm being paid, I want to be paid more, they can be fired and replaced with a different worker. And you see that happening in reality a lot of the time. People, jobs get relocated overseas to where the labour's cheaper. Like a lot of American manufacturing was outsourced to places like China or India or Brazil. And so,
right. I mean,
when
I'm not saying that you can demand anything you want. I'm saying labor does have value, but if, like you said, if you try and implement some sort of minimum wage and say we're not working for less than $15 an hour, and there's somebody who's capable and willing to do the same job for half of that, you can expect, to lose your job. But that's to the benefit of the system, as I see it,
And
because the same work's going to get done. And
well, that was that was the sort of destruction I was talking about with negative liberty. How that's what I was trying to get at, which was that yeah, they're not necessarily being the person who's being fired in that situation. They're not having their liberty taken away from them in the sense that they're not being denied the opportunity to work there, but in a sense they are being denied their liberty because they're having that opportunity taken away from them, and they're having an opportunity that was once available to them, not being available to them anymore.
well, I don't see how you would remedy that. I mean, I could say, okay, GM, you're not allowed to fire your workers, even if they're asking you for $25 an hour, and somebody else is going to do it for 15. You have to just keep paying them for $25 an hour.
Well,
That's unfair to the laborer, or the potential laborer who's going to take that $15 an hour job that they want. I mean, if there's somebody getting
people want lower wages. Is that what you're saying?
no, I'm not saying the $25 an hour person wants a lower wage. I'm saying if they're moving their factory to, let's say, Mexico, and there's a Mexican who says he's going to work $15 an hour, that's because that's better than what he's got. So it's a benefit to him for the factory to move there, and he's moving up in the world if he gets that job. So if you say, no, we're going to leave it where it is, and we're going to force the company to pay $25 an hour, that guy who would be working for 15 is out of a job, and the production's going to be more expensive, and that's going to hurt the businessman, the consumer. The product's going to have to be more expensive. So it seems sort of like a narrow focus to just say to this one person is entitled to demand whatever accommodation they can imagine.
Right. So you said quite a lot there, and you said some rather interesting things about. If I could just address one of the points that you made, which was that you talked about, jobs being moved to Mexico, and the Mexican worker who was there, they're moving up in the world because of that. And I think that's a rather interesting way of looking at it, because what we can see from that is that in the system that you're describing, if the only way to move up in the world is to work in the employment of somebody else and, take the best thing you can get, I don't think that's really a just system, because the thing you're describing there is exposing the fact that, competition over jobs, at least as it exists right now, causes that kind of, oh, I'll work for less, and eventually people compete to such an extent that, it becomes a competition to see who can work the most for the least amount of money. And that's where the whole system of a free market, that's where it doesn't provide for people, and that's where it takes away their positive liberty. Because yes, you may be able to work for whatever company you want, but at the end of the day, if the work you're doing there, you're only doing that because it's the best you can get, that shows that there's something that people aren't being provided for to the extent that they could be. And I think that the present day system where people have to compete over jobs to see who can do it for the least, that to me really signifies that there's something drastically wrong with the way that system is working if people are fighting over the scraps, when in reality the people who are providing the jobs to them, they live in complete comfort and complete luxury, and they don't have to go through that kind of struggle.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't characterize it as fighting over the scraps. To me, for one thing, nobody's putting them in a position where they have to take the job. I mean,
well, I would argue the contrary. I'd argue that they are compelled to do that because if they don't take the job, then they're going to be unemployed and they won't be able to provide for themselves. So yes, nobody is pointing a gun at their head and saying you have to take this job, but a metaphorical gun is being pointed at their head by the rest of society, saying if you don't take this job, you're going to be unemployed. You're not going to be able to provide for yourself. And we can debate forever about semantically that's a different thing, but in reality it has the same effect. I think that's more important than just talking about these concepts.
Okay. I think we've kind of exhausted that topic a little bit.
Yeah.
I know where you're coming from. I wonder, we've been going kind of long, but I wanted to talk. Go ahead.
I was just about to bring up that point. It's getting quite late where I am right now, and I think we can sort of wind down the discussion now, sort of get towards the end.
Okay.
So you can make the final point you'd like to make.
Well, maybe it's not a good time then to open up a whole new subject, but I did kind of want, if maybe you could just touch on it briefly. I was hoping to get to your idea of value, as I imagine that you have sort of a material idea of value, whereas I think that value is totally subjective. Is there anything you want to say about that?
Well, I'm not really that well read on the labour theory of value, but yeah, I do think that value to an extent has a material basis and is not subjective, because I remember reading Wage, Labour and Capital by Karl Marx quite a while ago, and what he was saying was that, to me, both systems kind of make sense to an extent, and reading Marx, he takes that into account, because what he says, or at least in the way I interpreted it in my reading of Wage, Labour and Capital, was that he said that the main sort of focal point around which the price of a commodity can fluctuate is based in labour. However, the specific price of that good at any one time is based subjectively, is based in like supply and demand, and how much of a value is how much a product is valued. So yeah, I think both systems are true to an extent, and I think no, I was going to make a point there, but now it's gotten away from me.
So I think if I understood what you said, there's some sort of real value to goods, but it's not always going to correspond with the price.
Yeah. Because if you have something that costs a certain amount of money to produce, it can't ever really be sold under that value, because then the person making a loss. However, the value can still fluctuate. It isn't based entirely in the labour that went into it. But both systems they're both kind of true to a degree in a market economy, at least.
Okay. Did you have any last questions for me?
Not necessarily. I mean, there were a few things that I did want to bring up, but that we never had a chance to get onto. But I think that would be that would be a pointless endeavour to go into them now. But yeah, no, I think this has been a very nice discussion. I've enjoyed talking to you a lot, and I think you have said a lot of things that really did make me sort of question my own views, and I hope the reverse has been true as well.
Yeah, I think it was a really good talk, and I think we both were honestly listening and having a conversation. That's kind of what I was going for, more than an opportunity to just make points.
Yeah, a lot of people, when they talk, they're thinking, this person's wrong, I've got to prove them wrong. But I don't think that's always true, and I think these sorts of discussions are very productive if both people go into them with an open mind.
Yeah, great. Hopefully, somebody else will get something out of this, and I'll go back and listen to it and think over it, and maybe we can do this again some other time.
Yeah, I've enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Definitely.